Hey there, and welcome back to the Parable Podcast. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. Today, you're going to hear from a new friend of mine, Taylor Carlier, as she shares a story of walking through figuring out her next steps in her career, personal family issues, and healing.
And I'm looking at these pictures and I just start praying over them. And I'm praying over like my dad as like a young dad, and my dad as this like child, and my dad as a newly married person that married into 3 kids at the age of 25 years old. And I'm praying over all these pictures and just asking God to like let me see him through empathetic eyes. And I am just sobbing and realizing that my dad, for the first time ever, realizing that my dad had gone through so much of his own pain and hurt and trauma, and empathizing with him in a way that humanly I could not have done by myself. There was no way I was ever going to get to that point and truly understand like my dad's own pain and what caused all of this in this way that Holy Spirit really revealed to me that day. And that was the day that I forgave my dad.
Here's my conversation with Taylor Carlier. All right, well, joining us today is Taylor Carlier. And Taylor, we met a couple weeks ago at a women's event.
So fun.
Yeah, I was so excited to meet you and kind of be connected. And so here we are. Now we get to learn so much more about each other.
Yes, I love this. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure, of course. Taylor, you got your Master's of Evangelism and Leadership, okay? How did that come about? Were you like, I'm going to get my master's? Was that a surprise or something you had planned for?
I mean, I had not really planned for that, no. But I will say we met through our mutual friend, Aubrey Sampson. So I met her through this program. So a lot of great things came out of it. But I guess it was 2017. I kind of was at the end of doing a lot of volunteer ministry leadership type things, like leading small groups and then leading the women that led small groups and leading the women that led the women that led the women. I was getting higher up in like leadership, volunteer leadership within my church. And I loved it. But I was like, I feel like I need more. Like I need more than this. I need to know, like I've had my hands dirty for a long time in ministry, but I feel like I need the depth. Like I want to get like into the like depth of what I'm doing. Like I want explanations for the things that I'm doing or not doing right in ministry. And so I got an email. I was connected to Propel Women, and I got an email from them saying they were starting a master's in evangelism and leadership through Wheaton College in Chicago. And I was like, sign me up. And it was the first all-female cohort in Wheaton's history. So I was like, that sounds exciting. I love women. I love, advancing women in leadership in the church. And so I signed up, and then my life kind of changed from there.
What would you say was your biggest surprise from that? Was something that you learned or you didn't even expect by having that experience?
Oh my goodness. So many surprises. I would say my biggest surprise was that I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've been in the church my whole life. I grew up pretty charismatic, so Wheaton's a little different than that. But I found it really interesting that to put verbiage and words and explanations to things I had always known about God, about the church, about faith, but I had words for it that I never had before. And I think my biggest lesson actually out of my master's was understanding shalom. I know that's kind of like left field, but I had never heard the word shalom before I went to my master's program. I had no idea what it meant. I had never heard anyone talk about shalom in church. And so I really dug into it and studied it, and it anchored me and grounded me through some really hard times in my family, this idea of shalom, and then this like more experiential nature of shalom that I then tapped into. And I really began to understand that shalom is like, we're not promised on this earth that we aren't going to go through difficult times, that we're not going to have hard circumstances, but we are promised shalom. And so we're promised this peace that passes all understanding, that no matter what we're going through, that we are grounded in health and wholeness and peace and abundance through Jesus. And so it's almost like a quiet in the storm type of feeling. And I experienced shalom. I learned the word for it, and then I experienced it in my life. And I was like, oh, I get it. I understand what this is now. And so not to get too deep too quick, but yeah, I would say shalom was a huge takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. When either, I don't know, you're studying for for something, or you're writing a message, or you're preparing something, or just being with God, if something you don't really understand, or you're like, oh, that's great, but I don't think that applies to me. And then God really just does work. Like you said, you had that in your life at the same time. You're like, wow, just to recognize that, and God is going to use that to help you grow and learn. So that's amazing. In some of the notes that you had wrote before we started talking, you wrote in your email, like, God is building your life piece by piece. So as we think about your story, what does that mean for you? Kind of explain that, and maybe that kind of ties right into your story today.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think it does tie into my story. I would probably even start with saying that I currently don't have a job. And actually, when you met me, I was like, I don't have a job. I'm calling it my sabbatical. I don't know that it really is a sabbatical, but I did voluntarily give up 2 jobs. And so I guess it is a sabbatical. And so that has been quite an experience. And I do feel like the last 7 years especially have led me to this decision and to where I currently am. And so I would say that that is where, when I'm thinking of building blocks in my life, that God has been preparing me, especially in the area of faith, for my current situation and where I am, and stepping out into leaving 2 jobs that I loved. I was working full time in social media marketing for an agency here in Indianapolis. I'm based in Indianapolis, and I've been there almost 5.5 years. A very small agency. I'm so super close with my boss and his family. I've been very involved in their lives personally and business wise for a long time. And I knew for a long time I wanted to be in full-time ministry or something that I felt was more purposeful. But what I was doing at the agency, I loved. So I was marketing things that I didn't necessarily love, but what I was doing, I loved. And it was a small knit community. And so I had that. And then I was also, for the past 3 years, the producer for the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. And so that's also Aubrey Sampson as the co-host and Davey Blackburn. And I was very involved in that ministry and very tight-knit with Davey and Christy and their family. And I loved it. I'm obsessed with that. And I want to keep doing podcast related things for as long as I can. And so kind of insane to leave 2 things that you love, but I felt like I had a green light from God to do that. And by that, I mean, I had been praying for years about my next step and, what God wanted to do with me finishing up my master's this past fall, what he wanted to use that for. I had never made official plans, I'm going to get this master's and then I'm going to go do this kind of thing. It just has been something, like I said, that God has been building on for a while, piece by piece, ministry opportunity by ministry opportunity. And so I feel like the only way for me to describe how I got here is to go back 7 years ago when I was graduating from Purdue with my undergrad. And I left college. I recently rewatched a video of me at my church in college 2 weeks before I was graduating. I was giving a senior speech. Basically, they asked me to talk, and I was telling everybody in the audience that I was leaving college without a job, that I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do, but that I felt like God had just told me to go home to my parents' house. And I refused to live with my parents again. I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm watching myself in this video saying, I trust that God is my provider. I trust that if I take this step of faith and that I go home and that he provided for all of my tuition 3.5 years at Purdue, I paid fully out of pocket. I never took out one loan, and he provided every single penny the entire time. And I paid for everything myself. And so I'm saying in this video, as this 22-year-old, if he can do that, I know that he can provide me a job. So that's 2 weeks before I graduate. I go home. 2 weeks later, I get a job and I move out of my parents' house 2 weeks after that. Just the faithfulness of God. I mean, it started when I was a child, but specifically when I look at these past 7 years, I feel that that was a catalyst. God told me, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm always going to show up when you need me to. And you can trust me. If you feel like you can trust no one else in your life, you can trust me. That was kind of a catalyst in all of that. And then I would say I started taking gradual leaps of faith throughout the years. After my first job, I was like, well, what do I do now? And I felt like God was telling me to go to this ministry school my church was doing. So I did that and worked part-time at a coffee shop. I mean, I was like making ends meet. I was barely getting by, but I was like, this is what I want to be doing. This is where I know God's called me to. And I'm skipping a lot, but fast forward 2 years later, and my boss from the agency is a regular at this coffee shop. I think I only worked there for about 8 months, and then I did a short stint in government work. I worked at the State House here in Indianapolis, and then I went back to the coffee shop, and that's a whole nother thing. But I feel like God was giving me a little taste of what I thought I wanted, but telling me like, this isn't what I have for you. And so I go back to the coffee shop so defeated. You know, I thought that I was going to go work in politics or government work or, you know, do this communications legal stuff. And I go back to this coffee shop that I'm still making like no money at. And my boss, Duncan, he hires me resume unseen. He had asked me to work for him for almost a year. And I turned him down every single time because I was like, no, I'm not going to work for this guy that like comes into the coffee shop. And then I come back to the coffee shop completely defeated from my experience in government, and he offers me a job again, and I say, okay. And I worked for that man for 5.5 years. He never saw my resume, nothing like, and so it ended up that God was providing things for me again without me even knowing, without me even doing anything. I'm just showing up and doing the next right thing. And every step of faith, every yes, everything was leading to the next thing.
Taylor, before you continue on, let me ask you this. The idea of faith and fear, you know, you were asked, you felt like you had this faith and that you wanted to continue on and follow what God wanted to do. But did you have this sense of fear and like anxiety? Be like, I feel like I'm kind of bouncing back between a coffee shop and government work. And did you feel those feelings?
I was definitely scared at times. I would say more than anything, I was scared financially. Like, I don't know that anything else scared me as much, but I was scared financially. I grew up with a decent amount of financial instability. And so one of my biggest fears was to be in a lot of debt or to feel like I didn't have enough money to pay my bills. Or, you know, I just saw a lot of that turmoil in my household growing up, and I didn't want that in my life. And so there were definite moments of me like sobbing over bills and being, why am I working at a coffee shop and doing these ministry things? Like, and I was still, you know, the whole time I was working at the coffee shop, I was just heavily involved in my church, you know, doing all that volunteer ministry leadership stuff. And some of it I was getting paid for. I was doing some part-time work as well there, but I still was not making a lot of money. And I was like, I could go into the career world. Like, I have a degree in communications. I have, you know, this amazing experience. I had multiple internships and that 1-year fellowship and all of this stuff. I'm like, I could do that. I could go and just make money. I could ignore whatever this feeling is that I'm having, that God wants me to do something else. But I don't always think that God has like a path for our lives, but I do think that he has a better path for our lives if we decide to choose it. I know he would have shown up and worked in my life and been totally present if I would have decided just to go hardcore on my career, been a full-time journalist, or gone into government communications or whatever I thought I was going to, you know, do full-time. But I also knew that if I would have done just that I would have been ignoring this feeling inside of me that he had something more for me.
So you finally decided to take the job with Duncan. And then what happened next?
Like I mentioned earlier, like the agency I was working for was not a faith-based agency by any means, but I saw God use my boss and that agency in my life, maybe more than any ministry I've ever been involved in, period. And I would say like that provided me financial stability to keep doing ministry in ways I couldn't. My schedule was so flexible that I was able to do ministry in ways that other jobs wouldn't allow. It was a very loose schedule, just like working when you can and getting your work done. And it just was kind of the grace of God that I even took that job, because I had for so long like ran from it. And then it ended up being one of the most stabilizing factors in my life that carried me through some pretty traumatic things in my family. And then after that, some healing that I had to go through for years. And my job at that agency was the only constant thing in all of that. Like, I changed churches churches and all of that. I started my master's program during all of that. Friend groups changed, just different things happened. But like this job was my constant. And I feel like God knew I needed that, even when I didn't know I needed that. And so in 2017, to fast forward a little bit, I started my master's program. I went to my very first class at Wheaton, and I got home that weekend, and my mom sat me down and said that she was going to divorce my dad of, at that time, they were married for maybe 25 years, and that he had been sexually betraying her for the entirety of their marriage. This was kind of a shock to me. There had been some things the year prior that was indicating this to me, which I go into a lot of detail of this on the Nothing is Wasted podcast, episode 197, if anyone wants to go listen to it. You know, I go very in depth about this story because it's very nuanced. It's not cut and dry. But the year prior, I had some indications of this through various mediums and people. But then my mom kind of finally confirmed things to me. And that set our world in a spiral, but in the best way. Like, it saved our family. And it saved my parents' marriage, that we finally had our family problems out in the open for all of us to know what was happening so we could actually deal through them. That is incredibly helpful, but still incredibly painful. And that does not make life any easier initially. But I will say, sitting in 2022, that it was worth knowing what I know about my dad and about their marriage. And it was worth the healing and the pain and the ups and downs and the not knowing if they were going to get a divorce or not get a divorce, if I was going to ever have a relationship with my dad again. It was worth all of that to be where we are now, very healthy and healed and restored. My dad has been changed from the inside out, not just behaviorally, and my parents have stayed together. And that's not everyone's story, so I want to say that, and nor does it need to be everybody's story. A lot of sexual betrayal relationships, with the help of counselors and guidance, like, need to end in divorce, and that just wasn't my parents' path. And so I do want to mention that because I want to give permission both ways. Most of those situations are very nuanced.
Taylor, that had to be such a shock. You come home and when your parents say, like, I have something to tell you, immediately you kind of think that, but you're just like, wait, what is happening? And so tell me a little bit about when you're a child, you admire and love, and you're just a kid, you're growing, but now as an adult, you understand humanity, you see that people are sinful, and to now recognize that and like see that in your parents, like, it's hard. So how was that healing process and like wrestling with that for you?
It started with just like sheer anger. I'm an 8-wing-7 on the Enneagram, if anyone speaks Enneagram in your audience. That tells you a lot about how I felt in that situation, because an 8's worst fear is betrayal. And I was betrayed by my dad. And then also our go-to emotion is anger. So I was covering up all of my hurt and all of my sadness with just anger towards him, anger towards my mom. I was mad at her for enabling the situation, which I felt like she had. And a little bit of backstory is I was incredibly close to both of my parents. I'm the youngest of 4, but I'm my dad's only child. So my 3 oldest siblings are from my mom's first marriage. I was incredibly close to both of my parents, essentially grew up as an only child, even though my dad and I butt heads a lot. And I knew there was other problems in our house, like anger problems and financial problems. I never knew that this was happening. And I didn't know that really this was the problem that was beneath all of the other problems. And because we didn't know that, we couldn't address it and we couldn't root it out and deal with it and heal from it. So it was definitely anger for a long time. I did get involved in a Daughters of Sexual Betrayal group, and that was incredibly healing. I ended up leading that group for a few years and helping with some different retreats and things. And one of those stories that I like to tell that felt like a very pivotal moment in my healing journey was actually with that group. I found out all of this in 2017. In 2019, we were on a retreat for those daughters. I was helping lead the retreat, and there was probably about 8 daughters there of sexual betrayal. And we had this time where we went away and kind of like all sat separately, and the other woman, Kristen Carey, that I was leading the group with, she kind of gave us all a prompt to just have time to just pray by ourselves and listen to what Holy Spirit was saying to us at the time about our families, about our dads. You know, I'm leading this retreat. I'm helping her lead it, and I'm very, not focused on my own stuff. But then we have this moment where like no one needs my help and I can just go off by myself. And I open up my journal and I had brought a couple of photos with me of my dad when he was younger. And I'm looking at these pictures and I just start praying over them. And I'm praying over like my dad as like a young dad and my dad as this like child and my dad as a newly married person that married into 3 kids at the age of 25 years old. And I'm praying over all these pictures and just asking God to like let me see him through empathetic eyes. And I'm just like sobbing. And it takes a lot for me to cry and like cry hard. And I am just sobbing and realizing for the first time ever, realizing that my dad had gone through so much of his own pain and hurt and trauma, and empathizing with him in a way that humanly I could not have done by myself. There was no way I was ever going to get to that point and truly understand like my dad's own pain and what caused all of this in this way that Holy Spirit really revealed to me that day. And that was the day that I forgave my dad. It took 2 years for me to like actually forgive him. And really it took a lifetime. I was mad at my dad about plenty of other things before this. And so it took my whole life. Like it was until 2019. Like I had a lot of anger towards my dad of how he treated my mom, of how he treated me, of just our family in general. But that day, like it all broke free in an instant. Davey Blackburn always says this. Sometimes God heals in poof. Sometimes he heals in process. And I've seen him do both in my life. That moment was a poof that had been before that had been a process. It took me 2 years to get to that poof. I really felt in that moment that like I forgave my dad. I would say that was the most pivotal healing moment of that journey. But all of these are like faith steps, right? Like all of these are like saying yes to things and showing up to things. Like I didn't want to go to that daughters group. There were a bunch of like 16-year-old girls in there and I was in like my mid-20s. Like I hate talking about my feelings. Like every single step, I fought God on all of it. Like I don't want to ever portray that I did any of this easily. You know?
Well, I think that's the funny part of it, Taylor, is that there's like these spaces in our lives. And going back to like that poof and the process, like there is a process because we think about our lives. We live in a culture that is just like, I want it now. And it's just not that way. And there needs to be that like inner work done. And that's how we get to faith. That's how we get to forgiveness. That's how we understand and empathize and realize the grace that Jesus has only given us. So now that you experienced that, it was cool that you were able to like to speak into those lives, but also of those girls, but God was utilizing that moment to shape you. Have you seen like people step into your life throughout this faith process to kind of help you along this journey, especially as you're transitioning jobs, as you're trying to figure out what your 20s are all about?
Yeah. Oh, 1,000% yes. I would say the first really big one would be when I transitioned churches in 2017. So that year that everything kind of hit the fan, I switched churches. I felt like God was calling me in faith to do that as well. And that's when I went to Davey Blackburn's church, which I didn't realize at the time would be very pivotal. I didn't really know his story that well or who he was that well, but I ended up going to his church and really like finding a lot of healing there. And then through that, I became close with Davey and Christy and was in a small group with them for a while the church was still going. And then after the church closed down, I felt like God was telling me to approach them and tell them that the ministry they were starting called Nothing is Wasted, that I would do whatever they needed, that I would help them with it for free. Like I would volunteer for them. And it was kind of risky. Like we were friends, but like, you know, he still was my pastor at the time. And so I didn't know if, you know, he like had to be friends with me or if we had a real relationship, you know, but I felt like that was what, like, I needed to step out and ask him that. And that's how I became the producer of the podcast. And so that relationship with Davey and Christy, and I was at their house every week recording podcast episodes, sitting in on interviews, helping them really build that ministry. Because before that time, it was just a podcast, and they had built it now into a full-fledged ministry that helps people going through any pain or suffering find purpose purpose in and through it and see where God meets them in that pain. And so it couldn't have come at a better time. I was sitting in hundreds of interviews, listening to people heal through their pain while I was trying to heal through mine. Not only was Davey and Christy influential and great people to, they both have their own pain stories. And so to be mentored by them, to be friends with them, to just like love on their kids and hang out in their house on a regular basis was pivotal. But then on top of that, I'm sitting in hundreds of interviews of heroes of the faith that have gone before me, that have made it to the other side, that have survived pain. It's not just still living, but thriving, right? Doing ministry, having purpose come through their pain. And so those people were all pivotal. And then to add to it, I would definitely say Aubrey was very much a pivotal part of that, meeting her in grad school. And then I, being the producer of the podcast, we needed a new co-host. And I was like, it has to be Aubrey. She had just wrote her book about lament. I'm like, our podcast is about pain and suffering. It's her, right? And she's so talented and amazing and so empathetic and has such a pastoral heart to her. And that's what our audience needed. And so bringing her on the podcast and then her and I developing even more of a relationship over these past couple years, she's become very much like an older sister to me in a lot of ways. And her and Kevin have been so gracious to, I just come and stay with them every once in a while. That's how I met you, and, hang out with them and their boys. And Aubrey is a constant source of encouragement to me. And I would even say it kind of ties into this current situation. Like, she has been so helpful and such a strong voice as I decided to step away from my jobs, that her and I we're fasting and praying together right now about my life and about her life. And to have somebody like that, like a woman in the faith that has gone before me and is living a life that I would want to live, to come alongside of me is huge. And when you're taking faith steps, to have somebody that's like, oh, I've taken lots of faith steps before, like I know what this looks like, but also like, I'm going to bring you along for my faith steps as well. Like, that's her and that's her heart. And I mean, I could talk about Aubrey forever. I love her.
Taylor, that is so true. Of like just bringing people in. I think somebody mentioned something I said to them last year, which I don't even remember. I mean, I vaguely remember, but I almost had an out of body experience, because I'm like, did I do that? Did I share that? And obviously that was only the Holy Spirit, because that meant so much to them. So it's in those simple things of like having people over for dinner, being willing to pray or just be a part of each other's lives. That is what, community is about. That's how we grow as, sisters and brothers in our faith. Gosh, I think that's so beautiful. I love those kinds of relationships, because you can look back and you're like, exactly. I know why that person was in my life at that moment. So for your life right now, you have no jobs. You are on a sabbatical. What is something that you're seeking right now?
I kind of have always said that I felt like God has been weaving these two parts of me together for a long time. And it's these talents and these gifts and this experience in communications and writing. I've experienced in, journalism and writing and interviewing and speaking and podcasting and, this like communication side of me simultaneously with this ministry side of me, this desire to elevate women in leadership, to equip women leaders, to show the church that we're missing half of the voices when we don't elevate women and we don't put them in the rightful place that Jesus put women. So I feel these two things inside of me that have been these separate things for a long time that I feel like God wants to combine. And I don't know exactly what that could look like. Like I said, I've really come into my own when it comes to producing. I was producing creative work for my agency, so it's photography and videography stuff for a bunch of clients, and then producing the podcast for Nothing Is Wasted. And both of those things really brought me a lot of life. I really liked putting those parts and pieces together and coming up with content ideas and execution and marrying my creative with my strategic brain. I love that. And so I'm hoping and praying that like it might be in the podcast world or production world. But I know that now it needs to be like faith-based and something that I'm doing full time. I think it could go a lot of different ways, or it could be something that I'm completely missing. Like, I don't believe that anything experientially that I've done was an accident. And that, like we said at the beginning of this podcast, that there's been a lot of building blocks in my life to get me to this point. And I don't believe that God asked me to step out in faith and walk away from these 2 jobs for nothing. I'm praying and seeking his face, and I don't know what's next, but I know that I've been reading Hebrews during this time, and specifically Hebrews 11, because I'm talking about faith, right? And the heroes of the faith. And I've kind of noticed this I was reading in my study Bible, this thing about inheritance that comes with faith, and talking specifically about Noah and Abraham, and how Noah's inheritance was given to him because of his obedience, because he had built that ark. And so it was given to him out of that obedience. And then Abraham's inheritance was something he had to go out for. He had to leave his place for. And it was something that he never saw on this side of eternity. So I wrestle with that, because I do believe that, like, my faith steps are going to bring an inheritance, but I don't know what that inheritance is. And I don't know if I'm Noah, if I've just been building this ark for a while and I'm going to see, right, like the fruits of that, and like what that is for me and my family and, you know, my experience, or if I'm Abraham and I need to go out to a new place. I need to leave my current situation and take a faith step that looks different. And so you're catching me very in the middle of things, Danielle.
Final thought, Taylor, is that if somebody is at this place, and it doesn't matter, you know, what age you're at, you know, because I was just talking to somebody the other day, and she's 70 years old, and she feels, you know, like, is my life wasted? Like, you know, what purpose do I have? And so we all go through these processes. What would be your encouragement to somebody who is at this place, this like crux of faith, and they're just like, what do I do next?
I would say you wait on God. And I know that that's the last thing that anybody wants to hear, but that faith steps are very much, I've been learning, are very much a confidence game. I don't want to call it a game, but it's about confidence, about having confidence in God and who he is and what he's saying, and confidence in the unseen, right? That's what the Bible says. And so that confidence is waiting or doing what God says you're supposed to do when everything else doesn't make sense. Like when logically it's not lining up, when financially it's not lining up. Why would I give up 2 paying jobs? I have no idea. It's not making any sense in my brain. It doesn't make sense logistically, you know, but that is very much having this confidence in the unseen, I think matters a lot with faith, and being willing to wait on God for his direction and the next right thing that he is calling all of us to. I believe that he does that on the daily, in the small moments, in the small conversations, and then he does it in the big leaps, like quitting your jobs or going on a first date with someone you don't know, or I don't know, just the moments in our lives that seem scary and unknown and unsure. You know, he requires that of us, but I do think it's this confidence in the unseen, this quiet assurance is really how I try to take my steps.
Faith is really hard. It really is. And I think, you know, when I go back and I think through the people of the Bible, like it wasn't like this picture perfect storybook where like, oh, I have faith and I'm going to be great forever. It is the process. And that's where it's relatable. And I am just grateful that God chose those people for us to look into and learn about, because it's relatable. So Taylor, thank you so much for sharing about faith, those hard next steps, those unknown next steps. If people wanted to get connected to you, how can they do that?
I would say mainly I'm alive on Instagram. If you want to follow me at Taylor Carlier, I know that's already confusing enough. It's Carlier is my last name. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. Send me a DM. I'd love to chit chat. If anyone has a job for me, let me know. But I would love to connect and yeah, hear your stories of faith and how God's working in your life. So please reach out.
Taylor, we'll put your resume in the show notes.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. We appreciate you being on the Parable Podcast. I hope this conversation with Taylor, surviving these difficult family issues coming to the surface helped you witness that there is healing even in the hardship. Some takeaway questions to think or journal about this week after our conversation with Taylor. Number 1, how can you choose to align yourself with the path God desires for you? How can you do that this week? Second, how have you thrived because of the people God has placed in your life? Thank you so much for listening. I so appreciate all the encouragement and support. We want to let people know about the Parable Podcast because we believe stories matter. So you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, whether on Spotify, Apple, and we even are over on YouTube. If you can leave a rating or review, that really helps others find the show. I'd love to connect with you more. You can find me hanging out on Instagram or Facebook. It's at Danielle Zapchenk. That is Zapchenk. If you have any more questions, or you want more information about today's show with Taylor, all of the show notes are at daniellezapchenk.com. That will do it for today. Thank you so much for spending time with me. Remember, your parable, it showcases the goodness and mystery in the unknowing. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.